Okay. So outdoor recreation is typically assumed to be compatible with biodiversity and conservation, and is usually permitted in most protected natural areas worldwide. However, as we've heard today, an increasing number of studies are discovering that there are negative effects of recreation on wildlife.
To the slides here.
Okay. So our interest in this topic was spurred by an overwhelming demand for recreation use on the Deschutes National Forest. And there's a need for biologists to provide adequate and consistent analysis of effects to wildlife resources from recreation development. This has traditionally been a difficult issue for biologists to analyze for many reasons. Traditionally, recreation development often occurs in a piecemeal fashion, so one trail at a time. Impacts are hard to measure and quantify, and there is that common assumption that trails have limited impacts. So a walk or a ride in the woods seems like one of the most benign activities that you can imagine, when in fact wildlife respond in very interesting and sometimes substantial ways to just the simple presence of humans in their habitat.
And so this has been touched on briefly in a couple presentations, but to summarize impacts to wildlife, we start with direct impacts, things like collisions, wildlife displacement, habitat avoidance. Unpredictable human presence in wildlife habitat can force animals to decide between risk avoidance and fitness enhancing activities such as foraging, finding mates, or caring for their young. It can cause increased energy expenditure during vulnerable times of the year, such as in the winter when food resources may be scarce, or when animals are pregnant, lactating, or caring for their young. And then we have indirect and cumulative impacts, including things like habitat degradation. So these effects generally impact wildlife habitat instead of the individual animals, and occur at a different space or time than the direct disturbance, or may occur over a longer period, a longer span of time than is perceived by any individual recreating, which makes them difficult to address. Habitat degradation includes things like soil compaction, loss of vegetative and structural components of wildlife habitat, sedimentation, issues with human waste and trash, and habitat contamination like we see in the case of noxious weeds, aquatic nuisance species, or more recently with white nose syndrome.
So the current recreation demands on public lands are unprecedented, being driven by growing populations and increased tourism. And with Bend being a showcase destination for outdoor recreation, there's many good things attached to this growth, but a major challenge for land management agencies is how we balance this desire for more recreation with all the other important benefits of public land, like wildlife habitat. That benign walk in the woods that we talked about takes on a very different meaning in the context of you being one of over 500 people enjoying that same trail on the same day. These are use numbers that we see in places like Benham Falls, or visitation at Lava River Cave, which is one of our show caves on the Deschutes National Forest, which use has more than doubled in 5 years. And beyond the magnitude of use, additional challenges include new technologies. So we now have drones, side-by-sides, fat bikes, e-bikes, and modern snowmobiles that are able to access deep in the backcountry. New technologies have brought new pressures to public lands, uses that were not foreseen by any management plans currently being implemented, and uses without clear precedent for how to manage them. How many of you even knew that motorized wakeboards, electric off-road skateboards, and fat tire segways were a thing that we had to worry about? These are things that we have seen lately. And how do we deal with that in our projects? So as these new uses come forward, people want trails and recreational areas devoted to these new activities and uses. And sometimes people have a low tolerance to share those trails with each other. So impacts are widespread. Demand has resulted in a landscape saturation of roads and trails, providing easy human access to large expanses of wildlife habitat. We currently have enough official trails on the Deschutes National Forest that you could recreate every weekend from May to the end of September. And to cover all the trails, hiking or biking, you would need to travel 38 miles per weekend, and you would still not see the same inch of trail twice. Yet we have a constant backlog of new trail proposals.
So at a landscape scale, we can address concerns such as barriers, habitat fragmentation, and impacts to habitat connectivity. Landscape connectivity is the degree to which landscapes facilitate animal movement and other ecological flows. Highly connected landscapes have few barriers where animals can move freely, moving through different habitats in order to meet their daily and seasonal life needs. Roads and trails result in large patches of wildlife habitat being dissected into smaller, isolated patches, resulting in decreased interior forest or core or refuge type habitats and increased edge effects. This makes an important point and a tie between recreation and habitat connectivity, that human disturbance likely influences connectivity and animal movement across the landscape for some species, as these barriers are not always physical obstructions, but could be caused by disturbance. Disturbance is also an important concept to consider in restoration efforts. Much work has gone into restoring the vegetative and structural components of our forests, as shown in this historical photo of Central Oregon's ponderosa pine stands with the large trees and the open understory, so open that you could drive a wagon through. This is often the reference photo used for our restoration projects on the Deschutes National Forest. But considering the needs of wildlife, is this truly a restored forest? I imagine the disturbance levels at the turn of the century were drastically different than they are now, and yet disturbance is rarely addressed as a restoration objective. This raises questions for me as wildlife biologist as to whether or not our restored forests are providing suitable habitat for native wildlife. And in some cases, the answer is definitely yes, and in some cases, the answer is probably not.
So wildlife habitat and recreational use are both very important values held for public lands. I believe we should actively engage in balancing these two values as individual recreation users, as a community, and as a public land management agency. And as a land management agency, there are many roles that we can play in finding solutions to this issue. Things like education and outreach, volunteer support, and community engagement. But today we're going to focus on a tool that we've been using to design smart trails by incorporating wildlife needs in trail design and recreational developments. So for a specific example, this is the Deschutes National Forest. And since human disturbance is often facilitated by roads and trails, we started with an overgeneralized distance banding exercise where we buffered all the roads and trails with disturbance corridors, depending on whether they were motorized or non-motorized. So as you can see in the picture, the blue represents what we call core habitat or refuge habitat, and the white is influenced by human presence. Our result of this banding exercise resulted in some watersheds without any core habitat at all, some as little as 8%. And cumulatively on the Deschutes National Forest, only 43% is identified as core habitat. So to put this in perspective, you could drop from an airplane anywhere on the Deschutes National Forest, which is about 1.6 million acres, and you are more likely than not to land within 200 meters of a road or trail. If we take wilderness out of those numbers, our core habitat is reduced to just 31% of the forest. And so that's habitat that's uninfluenced by human presence. So we realize this is a gross oversimplification simplification, but it seems like a good place to start. This information needs to be considered in conjunction with species-specific habitat needs and project-specific details at a smaller scale. And it's important to note here also that the white spaces do not represent non-habitat necessarily, just locations that are most likely to be influenced by human disturbance. So for effects analysis, a simple mapping process like this helps us identify where the largest undisturbed patches of habitat are. And these are where we would recommend habitat retention. We can also identify areas with potential for improvement, so those that we could restore, or areas where we would consider additional trail development with limited impact, where we could consolidate new trails or roads into existing disturbance corridors. So using a map like this as a starting point, we can consider impacts from recreation geographically, having a better understanding of where and how recreation and wildlife needs overlap.
So typically analysis techniques may include measures of road or trail density, and this is often how it's addressed in a lot of management plans or forest plans, described as miles of route per mile of area squared. And this provides limited use in determining the actual effects because it has no specific spatial component. These images have the same route density as you can see, but you would imagine that they would have very different effects to wildlife. When just route density is used as a standard to limit landscape saturation of routes, it can encourage the opposite by forcing development away from places already disturbed and into undisturbed core habitat. And this is the opposite of what's logical and likely results in greater impacts to wildlife. So we've shifted away from using density and started to incorporate specific distribution information into our planning processes. Looking at the project level, here we have the Ryan Ranch Key Elk area, and this is important habitat for wildlife and highly valued for recreation. The city of Bend is just off the edge of the map, up in the upper right corner here. This analysis was done to provide feedback for a proposed 10 to 15 miles of new mountain bike trail through the middle of the Key Elk area. Using the concepts of core habitat and their specific distribution, we can start to use more meaningful measures to compare alternatives and compare pre-project and post-project conditions. So we measured the average core patch size, the total core habitat, and the core habitat split out by size of patch as shown on the map here in different shades of green, with the darkest patches being the largest intact habitat in the Key Elk area. The map on the left is the original proposal, and the map on the right is a modified proposal where we maintain the best habitat that was currently available. We consolidated new disturbance into existing disturbance corridors, and we incorporated some restoration activities to combine some of those small and medium patches into larger refuge patches. And in this example, we were still able to meet the purpose and need for recreation, actually increasing trail density and accommodating several important connector trails. But the average patch size and core habitat was improved from 49 to 68 acres. And those medium and large patches, the amount of coverage they had in the analysis area improved from 15% to 23%. We also use this distance banding map to measure how refuge patches relate to each other across the landscape and contribute to connectivity by buffering core habitat polygons and measuring how much they overlap with neighboring patches. This is based on the assumption that larger patches are going to generally be better for wildlife, and that large patches adjacent to other large patches are going to contribute to connectivity across the landscape. And so in this map, the highlighted polygons there are the polygons that had the highest number of connectivity acres. And so applying this to the Ryan Ranch Key Elk area again, we now have another consideration in where we choose to place disturbance on the landscape with new trail construction. And the results can be somewhat surprising in that small polygons are sometimes pretty important just because of their placement and proximity to other patches, as you see with some of these little ones here. And sometimes the largest patches may be providing a lot as refuge habitat, but are more or less dead ends when you're looking at connectivity across the landscape, and might indicate good places to look for restoration opportunities to take better advantage of those large patches. Comparing the original proposal on the left with the modified proposal on the right, we were able to increase connectivity acres by 40% in this project area. Just with the three simple strategies of maintaining large patches, consolidating new disturbance into existing disturbance corridors, and reconnecting those small and medium patches to build bigger patches with restoration work.
So recreation disturbance is a big issue to address, but I feel like we're starting to develop some ways of thinking about smart development and some useful analysis tools with promising results. We're hoping to expand our process to incorporate other resource needs as well, knowing that recreation disturbance is not just an issue for wildlife, but an important component for all resources to consider in managing our future forests. And some of the things that we're doing right now is working on a communication plan to go out to the public with this to help start to spread that message. So it's a work in progress, but I feel like we're starting off okay.
Is it? Yep.
Time for questions for these guys? A few minutes? Just repeat the question.
Laura?
Sure.
You know, wouldn't it be fun to get some of those signs that guy had from here and use it at Green Lakes? And just say, shh, just enjoy. And, I mean, seriously, and see if you can influence behavior a little bit. Because that's one of your most popular trails, and you can do that while you work.
Yeah, and that's kind of a, oh yeah, repeat the question. If, we could use signs similar to we saw in the Mirror Woods with a reminder of people to watch their volumes and keep noise pollution down. And that is kind of the fourth pillar to all this that we've been working on is some public outreach. This is an example of one of the interpretive signs we have up now at Phil's Trailhead, just an attempt to remind people that, these forests need to provide more than just the recreation opportunity that you're going to have on the trail, that in addition to that, it is wildlife habitat and has a lot of other important needs, and just trying to repeat that message over and over that these places need to provide for a lot of other things as well. More questions? Yeah.
How do you deal with threats to endangered species in this process?
Oh, yeah.
So the question was, how do we deal with threats to endangered species with this process? So we've done a cursory analysis of our road and trail density across the forest. And so we do have spotted owls. So we have an initial look at what the road and trail density is within each home range. And then with that, we would prioritize which ones we would want to go after first for restoration by closing those roads or trails, trying to move those out of those core habitats, those kinds of things.
One more question?
Yeah, what was the feedback from the recreation stakeholders when you guys modified the proposed trail plan? How did they take that?
It's still, repeat, what was the response from the recreation stakeholders as to modifying their trail proposal? And we worked really close with our recreation folks on this. We got involved early on knowing it was going to be a tricky project, having additional trails put in Key Elk area. We're just getting into the actual planning and decision-making part, so some of that's yet to play out, but I think the key part was that we came to the table early with lots of give and take and good ideas, and we're able to still accommodate the purpose and need, was that we could, get people from the community of Sun River into these other trail systems, providing some of those important connections. We were able to accommodate that, but modify it in a way that it was going to have lessen the impact for wildlife.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.